The glass-walled boardroom at Silvercrest Tech felt like a fishbowl as Richard Cole's eyes locked onto mine with predatory intensity. His voice cut through the air like a blade dipped in poison. "You'll never be leadership material, Joel. You're just a worker bee. Stay in your lane." The room erupted in cruel laughter that echoed off the polished walls. My cheeks burned with shame as 12 executives chuckled at my expense like hyenas circling wounded prey. I had just presented a customer retention strategy I'd worked on for weeks, staying late every night to perfect the details. Instead of consideration, I received public humiliation. The sentence sliced through my confidence, leaving me feeling exposed and worthless. I forced myself to nod professionally and sink back into my chair, swallowing the bitter taste of embarrassment that threatened to choke me. But something deep inside me cracked open in that moment. Not broke completely, cracked. Like an egg about to hatch something dangerous. As Richard continued the meeting, dismissing my months of research with a casual wave, I felt a strange calm wash over me. The shame was transforming into something harder, more focused. Under my breath, so quiet only I could hear, I whispered 4 words that would change everything: "We'll see about that." I returned to my cramped cubicle feeling like I was drowning in humiliation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, and every keystroke on my computer sounded deafening in the sudden quiet. My hands trembled as I tried to focus on the spreadsheet in front of me, but the words blurred together. Lee, my closest friend at the company, rolled his chair over from the adjacent cubicle with genuine concern etched on his face. "Dude, just brush it off," he said, placing a supportive hand on my shoulder. "Richard's always been a complete jerk to everyone. Don't let him get under your skin." But I couldn't brush it off. The words replayed in my mind like a broken record stuck on the most painful note. Worker bee. Stay in your lane. Never be leadership material. Each phrase cut deeper with every repetition. The hurt festered inside me throughout the day, slowly transforming into something else entirely. Fuel. Pure, burning fuel that made my vision crystal clear. I stayed late that night, pretending to work while everyone else went home to their families. The office grew eerily quiet except for the persistent hum of computers. That's when I discovered something that changed everything: an internal memo carelessly left on the communal printer. My blood turned to ice as I read the header. Proposed staff reductions, Q4 implementation, stared back at me in bold, corporate font. The memo wasn't supposed to leak for another 2 weeks, but here it was in my trembling hands. As I scanned the list of names, my heart stopped completely. There, highlighted in bright yellow like a target, was my own name. Richard planned to fire me, but that revelation was just the beginning of a much darker truth. Reading deeper into the document, I realized Richard was systematically gutting loyal staff across every department to pad his own obscene executive bonuses. Good people who had dedicated years of their lives to this company were about to lose their livelihood so Richard could afford another luxury yacht. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. But instead of despair, I felt something unexpected rising within me. Rage mixed with crystal clear clarity, creating a dangerous combination. This wasn't just about my wounded pride anymore. This was about every hard-working person Richard was discarding like garbage to fund his excessive lifestyle. I carefully photographed every page of the memo with my phone, my hands now steady with newfound purpose. As I deleted the evidence from the printer's memory, my phone suddenly buzzed with an unknown number. The voice on the other end would change my life forever. "Joel? It's Samuel Grayson. We need to talk." The voice of my former mentor from business school sent a chill down my spine. Samuel had been my professor 3 years ago, the one who'd taught me that corporate warfare was chess, not checkers. Hearing from him now felt like divine intervention. We arranged to meet at a quiet coffee shop downtown the next morning, away from corporate ears and prying eyes. Samuel looked older than I remembered, more weathered by years of boardroom battles, but his eyes still held that razor-sharp intelligence that had made him legendary in academic circles. I heard about what happened in the boardroom yesterday, he said, stirring his coffee with deliberate slowness. Word travels faster than wildfire in our industry, especially when it involves public humiliation. My cheeks burned again with fresh shame. It was completely humiliating. I felt like a child being scolded. Samuel leaned forward conspiratorially, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Richard is playing a very dirty game, Joel. But Silvercrest isn't nearly as secure as it appears to outsiders. There are deep structural cracks in the foundation, cracks you could exploit if you're smart about it and willing to take calculated risks. My pulse quickened as he slid a manila envelope across the table with the stealth of a spy. Inside the envelope was a confidential financial report that made my eyes widen in disbelief. Silvercrest was drowning in debt, hidden behind layers of creative accounting that would make Enron blush. The company everyone assumed was untouchable and financially bulletproof was actually hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. Richard's arrogance wasn't just personally offensive, it was strategically dangerous for everyone involved. How did you obtain this? I whispered, glancing around nervously. Samuel smiled with the confidence of someone who'd played this game for decades. Let's just say I have friends in strategic places who believe strongly in justice and accountability. As I studied the damning numbers, everything clicked into place like puzzle pieces finding their perfect fit. Silvercrest's foundation was far weaker than anyone realized, propped up by smoke, mirrors, and Richard's magnetic personality. Something ignited deep inside my chest, not simple revenge, which seemed too petty and short-sighted, but something much more profound. This was about justice, about proving that so-called worker bees could do infinitely more than just follow orders blindly. What exactly are you suggesting I do with this information? Samuel's knowing smile reminded me why he'd been such an effective teacher. I'm not suggesting anything specific. I'm simply sharing information with a brilliant former student who's intelligent enough to know what to do with it. That night, I embarked on the most intensive research project of my life. I dove deep into corporate ownership structures, learning about shares, voting rights, hostile takeovers, and backdoor acquisition strategies. My savings account was pathetically small, but I was discovering that information could be far more powerful than money when wielded correctly. Hours of research revealed that some of Silvercrest's early shareholders were growing increasingly nervous about the company's direction under Richard's reckless leadership. I compiled a comprehensive list of everyone who owned even the smallest piece of Silvercrest stock. Some names I recognized from the company directory, former employees who had accepted stock options instead of higher salaries during leaner times. Others were angel investors who had taken early risks when the company was just a startup dream. The more I investigated, the more I realized Richard's iron grip on the company was largely illusory. He controlled day-to-day operations through fear and intimidation, but actual ownership was scattered among dozens of shareholders. Many of these people had lost faith in Richard's leadership but felt powerless to act individually. My phone buzzed with a concerned text from Lee, "You've been unusually quiet today. Everything okay?" I typed back a simple response, "Just thinking." That was the understatement of the century. I wasn't just thinking, I was planning a corporate revolution. My breakthrough came when I located Jerry Walsh, one of Silvercrest's original co-founders who had been forced out 5 years earlier after a bitter falling out with Richard. Despite his departure, he still maintained ownership of 4% of the company's shares. A quick LinkedIn investigation revealed he was now struggling to keep a small startup afloat and desperately needed immediate capital injection. Desperate people make desperate deals, and Jerry was no exception. I called him directly, introducing myself as a Silvercrest employee with investment capital and genuine interest in acquiring shares. We met at a dimly lit dive bar where the beer was cheap and the conversations were private. Jerry was still incredibly bitter about how Richard had systematically stolen his innovative ideas and claimed credit for his groundbreaking work. By the end of our 3-hour conversation, I had convinced him to sell me his entire 4% stake for $30,000, significantly below market value, but desperately needed cash he could access immediately. It represented almost all of my life savings, but it gave me my first real foothold in corporate ownership. As we signed the transfer papers in his car, Jerry gripped my hand tightly. "Stick it to that arrogant bastard for me, kid," he said with genuine emotion. I looked him in the eye and made a promise. That's exactly the plan. Armed with insider knowledge and my first ownership stake, I made my next calculated move in this corporate chess game. I anonymously contacted a respected financial journalist, carefully pointing them toward publicly available information that told a dramatically different story than Richard's rosy quarterly reports. I didn't fabricate anything or provide false information. I simply connected dots that were already visible to anyone willing to look closely enough. The resulting article hit the business world like a precision-guided missile 2 weeks later. Silvercrest Tech, cracks in the foundation? The response was immediate and devastating. Nervous investors began asking pointed questions about discrepancies in financial projections. The stock price took a significant hit, wiping millions off the company's market valuation. Richard was absolutely furious, calling emergency meetings and demanding to know who was leaking sensitive information to the press. I sat in my humble cubicle, watching the chaos unfold around me with quiet satisfaction. But Richard wasn't finished with his campaign of personal humiliation. During the next company-wide meeting, he singled me out again with laser-focused malice. "This is exactly why certain people will never be true leaders," he announced, his cold eyes boring into mine like ice picks. "They panic at shadows instead of staying focused on real work that actually matters." The room erupted in nervous laughter, but this time I smiled faintly. Richard had absolutely no idea he was staring directly at his future owner. Richard's second attempt at public humiliation bounced off me like rain off a windshield. "Panic at shadows," he had said with such smug confidence. If only he knew that I was the one deliberately casting those ominous shadows across his empire. The irony was absolutely delicious. After the meeting, I contacted Samuel again to discuss the next phase of my increasingly ambitious plan. Samuel had been genuinely impressed by my strategic first move with Jerry's shares and my ability to manipulate media coverage. "You're learning this game faster than I expected," he said with obvious pride. "But 4% ownership won't get you anywhere near real power. You need to think much bigger and move much faster." That's when he made an offer that would fundamentally change the trajectory of my entire life. Samuel's private investment firm was prepared to loan me $200,000 to purchase a substantially larger ownership stake, using the shares themselves as collateral for the high-risk loan. It was an incredibly dangerous gamble. If my plan failed spectacularly, I would lose absolutely everything I had worked for. But playing it safe had already gotten me a pink slip and repeated public humiliation. Without hesitation, I shook his hand firmly. "Let's do this." Within 1 week, I had quietly purchased an additional 6% from various small shareholders through shell companies Samuel helped me establish with military precision. Becoming a shadow owner was intoxicating beyond anything I had ever experienced. I attended board meetings in my new role as Richard's personal assistant, a degrading assignment he had given me after my supposed attitude problem, taking detailed notes while secretly calculating how to acquire even more shares. The irony was absolutely perfect. Richard's pathological need to humiliate me had inadvertently given me front-row seats to every strategic decision and confidential discussion. During one particularly revealing meeting, Richard's CFO mentioned that their cash flow problems were significantly worse than public reports indicated. They desperately needed emergency capital infusion, and several silent partners were expressing serious concerns about their investments. My ears perked up like a hunting dog detecting prey. Richard tried desperately to project confidence and control, but I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "We just need to weather this temporary storm," he insisted with forced bravado. "Market conditions will improve soon." The CFO remained skeptical, his expression growing more concerned. "Some of our earliest investors are actively asking about exit strategies," he warned ominously. "They want out before things get worse." That night, I spent hours researching every name on Silvercrest's original investor list with obsessive thoroughness. If nervous people were looking to sell their stakes quickly, I intended to be ready with cash in hand. The CFO's dire warning proved remarkably prophetic. Within just 3 days, I received calls from 3 different investment groups desperately looking to offload their Silvercrest shares before the company's value deteriorated further. Word was spreading through financial circles that the company was far shakier than public appearances suggested, and the smart money was quietly heading for the exits like rats abandoning a sinking ship. It was the perfect storm for someone planning a hostile takeover. I immediately drained my remaining personal savings, maximized every credit line Samuel had helped me establish, and aggressively bought every available share I could locate on the market. The feeding frenzy was intense but brief. In one incredible weekend, I managed to double my ownership stake from 10% to 20% of the entire company. All purchases were carefully spread across multiple shell companies and legitimate offshore accounts, making them virtually impossible to trace back to my real identity. To Richard and everyone else at Silvercrest, I remained just Joel Bill, the insignificant employee trapped in Cubicle 47B. But behind the scenes, I was rapidly becoming one of the company's largest and most influential shareholders. Lee noticed I seemed different lately, more confident and self-assured. "You've been acting strange," he observed during lunch. "Like you know something important that the rest of us don't." I just smiled mysteriously and changed the subject, knowing he had no idea how absolutely right he was. Lee's increasingly perceptive observations began to worry me significantly. If my closest friend was noticing behavioral changes, perhaps I wasn't being as subtle and invisible as I had assumed. He confronted me directly after work on a Friday afternoon, his expression serious and concerned. "Joel, whatever you're secretly planning, please be extremely careful. Richard completely destroyed the last guy who tried to challenge his authority. Absolutely ruined his entire career and reputation." His genuine concern touched me deeply, but I couldn't reveal the truth yet. The timing wasn't right, and the fewer people who knew, the safer everyone would be. "I'm just focused on doing good work and keeping my head down," I lied smoothly. Lee shook his head in obvious frustration. "I've known you for 3 years. You're definitely planning something significant. Just promise me you won't let him destroy you, okay?" His heartfelt warning haunted me throughout the entire weekend, making me question whether I was being recklessly naive. Maybe I was playing with forces beyond my control. But then I remembered that damning memo, all those loyal employees losing their jobs so Richard could afford another luxury vacation. The fear evaporated like morning mist. On Monday morning, I discovered that Richard had hired an expensive private investigator to identify the mysterious, shadow buyer, who was systematically accumulating Silvercrest shares. The hunt had officially begun, but I was already several moves ahead in this deadly game. The private investigator was competent and thorough, but I had prepared for this exact scenario with Samuel's expert guidance. Every single purchase had been carefully routed through legitimate shell companies with completely untraceable ownership structures that could withstand intense scrutiny. When the PI began asking pointed questions about recent share transfers, I fed him elaborate false leads through Samuel's extensive network of contacts. We created an entirely fictional overseas investor, complete with fabricated company documents, a sophisticated digital footprint, and even fake social media profiles. While the PI wasted weeks chasing phantoms in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, I used the distraction to acquire another substantial 5% stake from a nervous pension fund looking to diversify their risky portfolio. I now controlled 25% of Silvercrest, still below the threshold requiring public disclosure, but substantial enough to wield real influence behind the scenes. The constant stress was taking a serious physical toll on my body. I had lost noticeable weight, developed chronic insomnia, and my hands trembled whenever I drank coffee. But every time doubt crept into my mind like poison, I remembered Richard's arrogant voice, "Stay in your lane." The worker bee was preparing to show him exactly what happened when you systematically underestimate someone's potential and determination. The transformation was nearly complete, and Richard remained completely oblivious to the corporate revolution happening right under his nose. My strategic media manipulation bore fruit again with devastating effectiveness. The journalist I had been carefully feeding information published a second exposé that was absolutely brutal: Silvercrest Tech's financial house of cards exposed. The article meticulously detailed the creative accounting practices, hidden debts, and questionable projections I had been tracking for months. Within hours, it went viral throughout the business community. Panicked investors began dumping shares en masse. The stock price plummeted nearly 30% in a single day, wiping hundreds of millions off the company's market valuation. Richard called an emergency all-hands meeting, his face red with barely controlled rage. "Someone inside this company is actively betraying us," he screamed at the assembled staff like a dictator addressing his subjects. "Leaking confidential information to deliberately destroy everything we've built together." His paranoid eyes swept I'll never work in this industry again. I'll personally make sure of it. The room fell into dead silence, everyone too terrified to move or speak. I maintained a perfectly neutral expression while my heart hammered against my ribs. Richard continued his unhinged tirade for 20 minutes, threatening everyone's job security and demanding absolute loyalty. I secretly recorded every single word on my phone, knowing this display of toxic leadership would prove extremely useful later. I leaked Richard's threatening tirade to the same journalist who had written the devastating financial exposé. The audio recording spread like wildfire across social media platforms and industry forums within hours. Employees began courageously sharing their own stories of Richard's systematic abuse and toxic management style. The hashtag #SilvercrestToxic started trending nationally, turning our internal company problems into a public relations nightmare. The board called multiple emergency meetings as damage control became impossible. Furious investors demanded detailed explanations and immediate accountability. Richard's carefully crafted reputation was imploding in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop the avalanche. More importantly for my master plan, terrified shareholders were panic selling their stock at fire sale prices to cut their losses quickly. I aggressively bought another massive 15% stake over 3 chaotic days, bringing my total ownership to an impressive 40% of the entire company. I was getting dangerously close to controlling interest, but the final push would be the most treacherous part of this elaborate scheme. Richard was completely paranoid now, suspicious of every employee and questioning everyone's loyalty. One careless mistake could expose my true identity before I could complete the hostile takeover that would change both our lives forever. Richard finally realized that someone was systematically consolidating ownership behind his back through coordinated attacks. During a tense board meeting where I was forced to sit silently in the corner taking notes, he exploded at the directors with uncontrolled fury. "Someone is buying us out from directly under our noses. We need to identify them immediately and stop this hostile takeover before it's too late." The board members exchanged increasingly worried glances as Richard's paranoia became obvious to everyone in the room. One brave director asked the question everyone was thinking: who possibly has the financial resources to acquire this substantial amount of stock without triggering disclosure requirements? Richard had absolutely no answer to offer. His expensive investigation had hit multiple dead ends, his private investigator was chasing false leads across 3 continents, and the anonymous buyer remained a complete mystery. I sat quietly in my corner, invisible as always, watching him unravel psychologically before my eyes. His growing paranoia was becoming painfully obvious to everyone who mattered. One concerned board member gently suggested he consider taking a temporary leave of absence to manage the stress and regain perspective. Richard's face turned purple with indignation. "I built this company from nothing. I'm not going anywhere." That night, while reviewing his personal financial records that Samuel had obtained through discreet channels, I discovered something fascinating: Richard was leveraged to the hilt personally. His extravagant lifestyle depended entirely on Silvercrest's continued success. Seeing Richard's desperate financial situation gave me a brilliant idea for the final phase of my plan. I needed him to completely lower his guard for the last crucial acquisition push. So I decided to play dead convincingly. I formally submitted my resignation letter, citing personal stress and desire to pursue other opportunities, in language that suggested complete defeat. Richard was absolutely thrilled by my apparent surrender. He accepted my resignation immediately, probably believing he had successfully eliminated a potential internal threat. "Smart move, Bill," he said with his most condescending smile. "Sometimes a person has to know when they're completely beaten and accept their limitations gracefully." His smugness was nauseating but necessary for my deception. During my supposed farewell period, I played the part of a defeated, broken employee with Academy Award-worthy performance. I cleaned out my desk with visible sadness, said emotional goodbyes to concerned colleagues, and even endured Richard's patronizing speech about learning to accept your natural limitations in life. Meanwhile, behind the carefully constructed scenes, I was making my boldest and most dangerous move yet. With Richard convinced I was permanently neutralized as a threat, security around share transfers became noticeably more relaxed. I managed to acquire another massive 10% stake in just 2 days, bringing my total ownership to exactly 50% of Silvercrest Tech. I was now just 1 percentage point away from absolute majority control. I finally revealed the complete truth to Lee on my last official day at Silvercrest. We met at our usual bar after work, and I methodically laid out everything: the systematic share acquisitions, the elaborate shell company network, the investigation I had been skillfully dodging for months. His jaw literally hit the floor in shock. "You own half the entire company," he whispered in disbelief, glancing around nervously like Richard might be hiding behind a potted plant. "Are you completely insane? He'll absolutely destroy you when he inevitably finds out." But I could see something else flickering in his eyes beyond the obvious fear. Pride. Genuine admiration. Maybe even a touch of envy at my audacious plan. "This is absolutely incredible," he admitted reluctantly. "But what's your ultimate endgame here?" Before I could answer his question, my phone buzzed urgently with a breaking news alert that made my blood run cold. Richard was announcing a desperate merger with a much larger competitor, a deal that would significantly dilute everyone's shares and essentially hand operational control to complete outsiders. My stomach dropped like a stone. If this merger went through successfully, my hard-earned 50% stake would become virtually meaningless overnight. I had days, possibly only hours, to acquire that crucial final 1% and legally stop him from destroying everything I had worked so hard to build. Richard had fatally underestimated one crucial legal factor: he needed formal shareholder approval for any deal exceeding a certain financial threshold. As a 50% owner, I could theoretically block the merger, but I needed ironclad proof of my ownership first. I spent a frantic, sleepless night with Samuel and his team of expensive lawyers, meticulously preparing documentation that would officially reveal my identity and holdings. We triple-checked every single transaction, every shell company connection, every legal pathway to ensure absolutely no loopholes existed. The board meeting was scheduled for the next morning, where Richard would present the merger expecting easy approval from what he assumed were scattered, powerless shareholders. Instead, I walked into that familiar glass-walled boardroom carrying a briefcase full of ownership documents that would change everything. Richard's face went completely white when he saw me enter the room. "What exactly are you doing here, Bill? You don't work here anymore, remember?" I smiled with newfound confidence and calmly took a seat at the conference table. "You're absolutely right, Richard. I don't work here anymore." I placed my legal documents on the polished table with deliberate ceremony. "I own here." The room fell into stunned silence as I formally blocked the merger as the company's largest shareholder. The worker bee had finally revealed his true identity. Richard's face cycled rapidly through confusion, disbelief, and finally pure rage as the lawyers carefully confirmed my ownership claims were completely legitimate. "This is absolutely impossible," he screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. "You're nobody. You don't have that kind of money or connections." But the paperwork was absolutely airtight. Every transaction was completely legal, every purchase properly documented and notarized. The board members stared at me like I had spontaneously grown a second head. The insignificant worker bee had somehow transformed into the queen of the entire hive. But my corporate revolution was far from over. Throughout the following weeks, Richard's personal scandals began surfacing with increasing frequency. His inflated expense reports, questionable contractor payments, and inappropriate relationships with vendors all came to light through anonymous leaks. I didn't need to actively push these damaging stories into the public eye. Richard's elaborate house of cards was collapsing under its own corrupt weight. Meanwhile, I quietly approached a retiring board member's widow and successfully acquired that precious final 1% I desperately needed from her late husband's estate. With 51% ownership finally secured, I legally owned Silvercrest Tech. The company that had systematically humiliated me now belonged entirely to me. Holding majority control felt absolutely surreal after months of operating in the shadows. For several weeks, I deliberately didn't announce my new role as owner, preferring to operate behind the scenes while Richard dug his own professional grave even deeper. I attended board meetings as a mysterious advisor, while secretly controlling every major decision that affected the company's future. It was intoxicating watching Richard attempt to exert authority he no longer actually possessed. Every arrogant decree, every dismissive comment about employees, every attempt to humiliate hard-working staff bounced harmlessly off my silent ownership like bullets off armor. The waiting game was entirely strategic. I wanted Richard to walk directly into the trap himself, creating the perfect moment for maximum psychological impact. That golden opportunity finally arrived when Richard scheduled a major investor meeting to reassure everyone about Silvercrest's bright future under his continued leadership. He was planning to spin all the recent negative publicity as temporary growing pains and position himself as the steady, experienced hand that would guide the company through the storm successfully. He had no idea it would be his final public performance as CEO, though I certainly did. The stage was perfectly set for the most dramatic corporate takeover in the industry's history. The crucial investor meeting was held in our largest conference room, packed wall-to-wall with institutional investors, financial analysts, and business reporters. Richard stood confidently at the head of the polished table in his most expensive suit, projecting an aura of control he didn't actually possess anymore. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began with practiced smoothness, "despite recent market volatility and completely unfounded rumors, I want to personally assure you that Silvercrest remains under my complete and total control." That perfectly timed statement was my long-awaited cue. I stood up slowly from the back of the room, every eye turning toward me with growing curiosity. "Actually, Richard, that's not entirely accurate," I said with calm authority that surprised even myself. The confident expression on Richard's face shifted to confusion, then recognition, then absolute terror in rapid succession. "Joel Bill owns 51% of Silvercrest Tech as of last Friday," I announced clearly, placing certified ownership documents on the table for everyone to examine. "Which legally makes me the majority shareholder and, effective immediately, the acting CEO of this company." The room erupted in shocked murmurs and frantic whispers. Richard swayed unsteadily on his feet, his face turning an alarming shade of gray. Then, in front of dozens of witnesses, he collapsed to the floor unconscious. The paramedics determined that Richard had fainted from acute shock and overwhelming stress. As they carefully wheeled him out on a stretcher, he managed to lock eyes with me one final time. His gaze was filled with disbelief, pure hatred, and grudging respect all mixed together. "This isn't over between us," he whispered hoarsely through gritted teeth. But we both knew with absolute certainty that it was completely finished. The investors and reporters immediately swarmed me with dozens of urgent questions, but I kept my responses simple, professional, and reassuring. "The leadership transition will be smooth and seamless," I assured them confidently. "Silvercrest's core business fundamentals remain strong, and will be implementing positive changes immediately. When Richard recovered and returned to his executive office later that day, I was patiently waiting for him. He desperately demanded I sell back all the shares, offering to pay twice what I had originally invested. I refused his offer without hesitation. This was never about money, Richard. It was always about real leadership and treating people with basic human dignity. His face twisted with uncontrolled rage and wounded pride. You actually think you can successfully run this company? You're still just a worker bee playing dress up. I smiled sadly at his predictable response. Maybe I am just a worker bee. But this worker bee just became the queen, and unlike you, I actually care about the entire hive. Richard's desperate legal challenges crumbled quickly under scrutiny. My acquisition had been completely legitimate, documented to the penny, and legally bulletproof against any possible attack. Samuel's team of lawyers had brilliantly anticipated every conceivable challenge and prepared accordingly. In court, Richard's once bronze reputation was systematically shredded as former employees courageously testified about his toxic management style and numerous financial irregularities. The judge dismissed all of Richard's claims with prejudice and ordered him to pay my substantial legal fees as punishment for filing frivolous lawsuits. Emerging from the courthouse steps, I was immediately swarmed by reporters asking how it felt to completely dethrone the man who had publicly humiliated me. This was never about personal revenge, I told them with complete honesty. It was about proving that effective leadership comes from serving others, not serving yourself. The business media absolutely devoured the David and Goliath story with relentless enthusiasm. Within weeks, I was appearing on magazine covers and being invited to speak at prestigious leadership conferences across the country. The humble worker bee had learned to fly with powerful wings, and everyone wanted to understand exactly how the transformation had occurred. My story became a case study in business schools, inspiring a new generation of corporate underdogs to fight back against toxic leadership. 6 months later, I stood in the exact same glass-walled boardroom where Richard had once mocked me so cruelly. But now it was filled with employees I had personally saved from layoffs, talented new hires I had brought into the company, and board members who actually respected and valued their workforce. The atmosphere was completely transformed, collaborative instead of toxic, innovative instead of fearful, hopeful instead of desperate. They told me I wasn't leadership material, I said, addressing the team that had become my extended corporate family. They said I was just a worker bee who should stay in my lane and accept my limitations. Enthusiastic applause filled the room, but I held up my hand for quiet. Today, I own 51% of Silvercrest Tech, but this company doesn't belong to me alone. I looked around the room at faces filled with renewed hope and genuine excitement. It belongs to all of us. Every worker bee, every dedicated employee, every person who believes in building something better together than we ever could apart. The worker bee had finally learned to soar on wings of justice. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now.